Coats are one of the most complex garments to make. The very first coat I made was not wearable, but over the years my skills grew, I learned a few professional techniques, and now I'm able to make coats that I love wearing for years. In this video, I want to share 10 tips that will help you sew better coats. Some of the tips will be very easy, some of the tips will be a little bit more complex, but hopefully you will be able to apply them to your next coat project, no matter what design you're going to make. Let's begin with the most impactful tip: focus on pressing. This tip actually comes from my sewing teacher back from sewing school. Back when I was at sewing school, she had over 40 years of experience working as a professional seamstress. She was amazing in everything sewing, but her true mastership was in coat making. Her coats looked phenomenal. They were the highest quality you can imagine, and she had clients that would return over and over again for her to make coats for them. So from all her experience, especially in making coats, she instilled to us that the #1 priority when making coats is pressing. And pressing is where you want to focus, where you want to spend the most time. To give you an idea how important pressing is for coat making, once she finished making a coat, she would spend 2 hours giving a coat its final finishing press. If you want to make better coats, if you want to elevate your skills in coat making, focus on pressing. And once you finish making your coat, set aside some time to give it a final press and set everything in its final place. Trust me, pressing will elevate the quality of your garment to the next level. Let's move on to tip number 2 is pressing the sleeve. Now, usually when you are working on coats or jackets, you have a 2-piece sleeve. One seam is shorter and the second seam that goes in the back is longer and a bit curvier. So before you start pressing that longer, curvier seam open, I want you to go ahead and from the wrong side of the garment, drag that seam and press. Drag that seam and press, and continue doing all throughout the curvy part of the seam. When doing this technique, don't be afraid to give your fabric a lot of steam because it will help shape fabric better. Once you press the seam this way, you can continue by pressing the seam open. The way I was taught to do this technique is that once you turn your sleeve to the right side of the garment, that extra piece right here should be equally spaced throughout the seam. This pressing will give sleeve that beautiful shape. Now that we're talking about sleeves, tip number 3 is use 3 rows of easing stitches. When you're working with sleeves, you may notice that the sleeve cap circumference is larger than armhole circumference. This is because we have extra ease on sleeve cap. And because of that, whenever we are installing sleeves, we need to ease it in so that we do not create any gathers. While making the coat you see behind me, I tested making 3 rows of easing stitches on the sleeve cap instead of standard 2 rows of easing stitches. The easing stitches were spaced 6 mm from the edge, 1.3 cm from the edge, and 2 cm from the edge. Having 3 rows of easing stitches allowed me to control the ease of the cap way better than just with 2, and I was able to install the sleeve in a very beautiful way. I learned this technique in this book of tailoring. This book cost less than $15, but it has so much valuable information. While I don't use all the techniques written in this book, it does provide lots of great tips, lots of professional techniques, and I really like that every single step is illustrated with very clear to understand photos. If you want to make your own coats, your own jackets. I will link this book in the description box. I think that it's invaluable resource and really worth having in your sewing collection. By the way, while I was making this coat you see behind me, I shared a few photos on my Instagram stories, and quite a few of you asked to show how to set in those sleeves. So please let me know if you would like to see a tutorial on how to sew in the sleeve. Now let's move on to tip number 4, and it's adding a small tape connecting the armhole bottom of the main coat fabric and lining. Now I shared this tip in one of my previous videos, but I also applied it when making this coat. Now for this particular coat, I took a very narrow twill tape and used about 2 centimeters to connect the bottom of the armhole from the wrong side of the garment and the bottom of the lining armhole, again from the wrong side of the lining, leaving about 1 centimeter space between. This piece of tape holds the lining in its shape so that when you're taking out that sleeve, the lining does not go away. And leaving that 1 centimeter gives enough ease so that the lining doesn't seem like it's stuck to the main fabric. And in this example, you can see that without the installed tape, you can just very easily take out the entire lining. But once that piece is installed in place, connected the armhole bottom of the fabric and lining, it stays in place. Very small detail, but it gives such a massive comfort when you're going to wear your coat later on. Now, 5th tip is use a tiny piece of fusible interfacing from the wrong side of the garment to prevent the top of the dart moving. Aside from pressing, using right interfacing and using it in correct ways will help you elevate garment quality the most. So when I was making this coat, it has a few darts, and at the top of the dart, when it's very bulky, you cannot really press it that well no matter how much you try, so it's best to use a little piece of fusible interfacing to protect the top of the dart from moving. And in this sample you can see what a huge difference this step will give. For this next tip, I did cut open one of my previous coats to show you how it looks from the inside. So tip number 6, if you're making coat for winter but you don't have a very warm material to work with, you can install padding. So batting fabric is installed on the front and the back pieces, but not on the collar and not on the sleeve. And it's a very easy way how you can increase the warmth of your coat. To install batting fabric, you can use very loose, very spare, invisible stitches. When doing the stitches, just make sure that they're not visible on the right side of the fabric. One additional note about this particular technique is that if you are adding batting, you have to account for extra ease it needs. If you're working with a coat pattern that is oversized, usually you can add batting without any problems. But if you're working on coat that is quite fitted, like this coat you see right behind me, if you add batting, it will shrink the garment from the inside and you simply won't have enough ease to make a comfortable coat. So because of that, if you want to add batting fabric to a design like this one, you have to increase the ease of the pattern. When batting is installed correctly, it's not visible on the outside of the garment. It doesn't look like a puffy jacket, but it adds so much warmth. Tip number 7 is something that you will actually be able to apply in many items you make, not only coats. So I try to emphasize how important right pressing is for coat making, but another side is overpressing. And usually the issue with coats is underpressing when the coat is not pressed enough. But on the flip side, the coat can also be overpressed. An overpressed coat will have visible lines of seam allowance on the right side of the garment, and it also might have fabric shine. So one way how to prevent that fabric shine is to add extra layer between your hot iron and fabric. On my iron, you may notice that I have something called iron shoe. It's a metal cover for your iron that gives that extra layer between your iron and fabric and thus protects fabric from shine. The one that I have is created specially for this particular iron, but there's also Teflon iron pad covers that will work on any iron, including domestic ones. I do recommend having that iron cover and I just always keep it on my iron. However, if you do not have an iron cover, you can use fabric piece and put it over coat fabric and then press with your iron. Be gentle when pressing and try not to push that iron down very hard because you will end up with overpressing. Tip number 8 is again about pressing. So when you're making coats, it's a very good idea to have tailor's clap. But if you don't have that, I learned a very great alternative from Dressmaking Amour. She's a professional dressmaker who has her own pattern line. And in her tutorials, she shows that instead of tailor's clap, you can use a folded towel and use it the same way as you would with tailor's clap. You give the seam a lot of steam and then press with folded towel, and it will very beautifully flatten that seam out. I tested this method when working on this coat and it works. Tip number 9 is about marking the fabric. If you ever try to mark coat fabric, you know that using chalk will disappear very fast, or maybe you won't even be able to create a visible line because coat fabric usually is very fuzzy. So the best marking tool for coat fabric is actually piece of soap. If you use hard soap when washing your hands, you can save that very tiny piece at the end. Or I, for example, bought a piece of Tailor's soap at the local sewing supply store for literally like 30 cents. It creates a very clear line. It doesn't brush away that easily, but once you give a seam lots of steam, the soap will disappear. And of course, if you need to transfer details on mirror pattern pieces, using tailor tags also works wonderful. 10th and final tip is use a thimble. I know, I talk about using thimble in so many videos already, but I cannot imagine making a coat without using a thimble. When you're making coat, there's so many basting stitches to be done. You have to add buttons, you have to add maybe buttonholes by hand, and you're working with lots of layers of very thick fabric, which is also interfaced, making it so hard to push that needle through. But once you put the thimble on your middle finger, you can give it a very good push, and it protects your finger and gives it extra power to push the needle through difficult fabrics. Again, if you're not comfortable with metal thimbles, try using leather ones or silicone ones. Just give it a try and I know that you love using a thimble. Here are all 10 tips I wanted to share today with you. And I have an extra question for you. Most likely I will be making one more coat this year, so let me know if you would like to get a sew along or some specific tutorial. Please let me know in the comment section down below. And I also wanted to share a few photos of this beautiful coat that I made recently. This beautiful coat is made using Burda Style pattern from 2007 January edition. This is when I started sewing, and this Burda Style magazine was the very first magazine that I ever bought. I made a few modifications on this particular coat. I removed the cuffs and I also added a few centimeters of extra length. This is absolutely amazing pattern, but my favorite detail is the curvy seam at the back. The pattern is very well drafted and everything fit so well, and I was very happy how that particular part looks because it just gives figure that beautiful shape. I absolutely loved how it turned out, and it's going to be one of my favorite coats. I hope you enjoyed this video. I absolutely loved making this coat and I cannot wait to make more coats in the future. Thank you for watching today, and I will see you next time. Bye!